So that's how I met Gabe, and I'm so happy you're here. We put him up at one of our volunteers' bed and breakfast, and then our other volunteers who are house sitting have fed him and are spoiling him right now.
However, the dog Foxy got skunked last night.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so there's been some drama.
Oh, just thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, April. It's a pleasure to be here. I will tell you, I've really been looking forward to this one because my book's about the 8th Virginia Regiment, which was raised on the entire Virginia frontier except for Botetourt County. So I cover a lot of territory in that book, but some of the very best stories come from down here. Today we're going to talk about Southwest Virginia in the Revolutionary War. For those who don't know what a long hunter is, I'm going to talk a little bit about them, and I need to warn you, I'm going to go after one of my childhood heroes today a little bit. When I was a kid, my heroes were Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Neil Armstrong. I got to meet Neil Armstrong briefly. Never going to meet the other guys. Daniel Boone, I'm gonna knock him down a couple pegs today. Is anybody going to be upset if I do that? Everybody's okay with that? Okay. What is Daniel Boone famous for? Whatever he's famous for, I'm going to tell you is probably not true. Anybody want to? Yes, that's true. Although that's not true either, I understand. He didn't wear a coonskin cap. Supposedly the first into Kentucky, not true, right? Opened the Great Wagon Road, sort of. Technically, not true. And I'm going to prove my case. And I'm going to elevate somebody else to sort of take his place. So, and he's from here, or near here. The long hunters, as you know, would go into Kentucky or somewhere, in the wilderness and hunt deer and collect deer pelts and bring them back for the deerskin trade, which was a big business. They shipped them mostly from Savannah, Georgia, but also other ports back to Europe. The deer hide, or buckskin as they called it. Buckskin doesn't mean it came from a buck. It's deerskin that's been dressed, ideally brain tanned. Makes it very supple and soft. It is breathable, it's pliable, it makes great gloves, and also breeches. So it was the stuff. And so they would go west and hunt deer and sell them. And if they went for a long time over the winter, it's easier to travel in the wilderness in the winter because there's less foliage, right? So they would hunt in the winter and come back. So they would be gone for many months, a long hunt. Daniel Boone is also credited as sort of the original long hunter, one of the first long hunters. I'm going to tell you who the real first long hunter was. There are some buckskin breeches. The ones on the right were worn by a Revolutionary War soldier named Andrew Kaiser from Shenandoah County. And they're in fantastic condition. They're in the little museum at Luray, at the caverns. Okay, here's the guy that I'm going to elevate, James Knox. So he is buried in Kentucky, but he lived around here and recruited one of the 3 early companies for continental service from this region. He was born in Northern Ireland, so Scotch-Irish, like lots of people who came here. He is said to have immigrated to Virginia all by himself at the age of 14, cashed in his inheritance and came here. Doesn't seem to be true. He settled in what's now Bath County on I think the Cowpasture Creek. But there are records that show that he lived with someone in the homestead of someone also named James Knox. Dad? Maybe an uncle. Maybe an uncle and he came by himself. So I'm a little skeptical about that story. He led an expedition into Kentucky in 1770. If you look at the old accounts in the Draper manuscripts, 2 or 3 people say that it's from that trip that the term long hunter comes. That's my interpretation anyway. So I brag about him and say he was the original long hunter. He was a guide for the 1774 surveyors under John Floyd that had a very hard time in 1774. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. He then retraced pretty much the same route for Andrew Lewis's division as a scout and guide before the Battle of Point Pleasant. He was a lieutenant in the Southwest Independent Frontier Company in 1775. And then he was appointed by the Fincastle Committee to be a captain in the 8th Virginia Regiment at the same time that Joseph Crockett was appointed for the 7th. He rose to major and then left the Continental Service when they downsized. People who had just been promoted got booted. And he then formed a battalion just like Crockett's Western Battalion. There were two of them, Crockett's Western Battalion and Knox's Western Battalion. But they didn't recruit enough, so they were merged. And then Knox was out of a job. He led large pack horse trains of settlers through the Cumberland Gap. And there are accounts of these. He was then in charge of the expansion of what is sometimes called Boone's Trace, also Skaggs Trace, depending on where you are, into a proper wagon road. In other words, the wilderness road. Right? Before that, I think historians usually call it like the warrior's path or something like that. Here is evidence, though, that he may have been deep into Kentucky before Daniel Boone. So this is from the Draper manuscripts. Robert Wycliffe, he was one of these guys that sort of knew all about early Kentucky history. I think his family had gotten there very early. And he wrote in a letter to Draper that James Knox was in Kentucky in the fall of the year 1768. That's really early. And named Dick's River after the Indian Dick, who was a Cherokee, who pioneered him to it. Boone never saw the country until 1769. Well, that's unambiguous. Now, he's saying this many years later. But Daniel Boone himself says, on the first day of May in 1769, I resigned my domestic happiness to wander through the wilderness of America in quest of the country of Kentucky. So that date, Boone himself says it was then. So if you're not persuaded, how about the daughter of Benjamin Logan? So Mrs. Mary Smith, the daughter of Benjamin Logan, whose widow Colonel Knox married, says Knox came to Kentucky with Skaggs Bryant and one or two others as far as the Laurel River. Some of the company on their return went and told Daniel Boone what they'd seen. So that's a fair amount of evidence there, right? That Boone was not first. So knocked down a peg. But I met Neil Armstrong. Okay, another guy who's important here is John Floyd. I think many of you know quite a bit about him. He was born in Amherst County, moved to Botetourt County, and then it was split again, and then he was in Fincastle County. He worked for William Preston in, I think, several capacities. He was a teacher there at Smithfield. Preston was the surveyor for Fincastle County. John Floyd was one of the deputies. In other words, he did the work. And he led one of two survey groups into Kentucky in 1774 to cite land grants for veterans of the French and Indian War. So the Virginia Regiment, which is Colonel George Washington's regiment, their reward for service was land in the West. And it had been impossible to give it to them all this time. But after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, it was now practical. Floyd and another guy named Hancock Taylor went west to do surveys. They had been done the year before, but illegally. And while they were out there, Lord Dunmore's War started. And so some of the guys never made it back. You know what that place is? That's Smithfield, the home of William Preston. That is where the surveyors started out. And there is a diary that gives a full account of Floyd's. There were two groups of 8 surveyors each, one under Floyd, one under Taylor. Who's the uncle of President Taylor, by the way. So they started out at Smithfield. They got to the New River where the Gauley River goes into it, at which point it becomes the Kanawha River. They then floated downriver in canoes that were made on site. They surveyed land for then still, I think, Colonel Washington. Along the Kanawha. They got to Point Pleasant. When they got there, they found a whole bunch of people who were in a panic because there was a war starting. Shawnee had said, the treaty said, from 68, said that the Indians stayed on the north side of the Ohio and white people could settle on the south side of the Ohio. But that treaty was with the Six Nations, the Iroquois, not with the Shawnee who actually lived there. And the Shawnee were mad. So they had declared, well, we're going to be on both sides of the river, which was like a declaration of war, right? So people are in a panic and they're congregating at Point Pleasant trying to get east. And then all these armed men show up and they're like, well, can we go with you guys? There's safety in numbers. And some of them did join the surveyors and continue downstream. So that path shows you everywhere they went to do their surveys. By the time they got to the Falls of the Ohio, which is now Louisville, Kentucky, that was primo land because the falls are there, which meant the boats had to stop there, which means there's going to be a city there one day. By the time they got there, things are really getting hairy. People are starting to disappear. They had run-ins with Indians. They split to do a bunch of surveys, and somewhere around here on the Salt River, it just all fell to pieces. And they were supposed to rendezvous at Harrodsburg. Knox got there, and the place had been destroyed, and there was nobody there. Hancock Taylor's dead somewhere. They found him later. Knox made it back, rescuing some of the people who had settled in Harrodsburg. And when they got back to Rye Cove Fort, which I think is in Powell's Valley, the war had really started. And they were already recruiting militia for the Point Pleasant campaign. And so Knox immediately signs on as a scout and retraces half of the route up to Point Pleasant. I don't need to tell you about Andrew Lewis much, do I? He's here because he's important. But another Scotch-Irish guy. He was in command at the Battle of Point Pleasant, fought in the French and Indian War, was with George Washington at Fort Necessity. He was Virginia's first brigadier general in the Revolutionary War. He was passed over for promotion because people were grumpy with him, so he quit in a huff. But he was picked to be in Thomas Jefferson's executive council under the new Constitution. That's Governor Thomas Jefferson. And he died early in 1781. He was the commander in Dunmore's War. Just a little bit, I don't want to talk too much about Dunmore's War, but there were two wings. There was a southern wing and a northern wing. It's all militia. And the southern wing is under Andrew Lewis. They rendezvous at Camp Union there. The northern wing rendezvoused sort of at Fort Pitt, but really at Wheeling. And there's two ways to get to where they were headed. One was to hike up the New and the Kanawha, and the other is to go to Fort Pitt and float down the river. Andrew Lewis, later a major general in the Continental Line, he's in command of the northern wing, but Lord Dunmore, the governor's with him, so he's really in charge. Andrew Lewis is in charge of the southern wing, and they get to Point Pleasant. The Shawnee know they're coming both ways and decide it's better to have a fight with half of the army than the whole army, so they attack right away. They're beaten, but it's a close fight. It's something like 900 men on each side. And then Dunmore gets there. He goes up to Camp Charlotte. Chillicothe is the main Indian town, and they negotiate a treaty. Lewis's men are nearby, but Dunmore says stay away because they're still hot from the battle, and he's worried that if they come too close, they're going to start shooting people. The treaty's notable. It actually wasn't a treaty, it was an armistice. It was sort of a ceasefire. And they were going to negotiate the formal treaty later. Dunmore, all he asked for was safe passage on the Ohio River for settlers, for the return of captives, the return of horses. He took no land from the Indians. So, fairly reasonable. So that was Dunmore's War. And that for soldiers from the west of Virginia, this was really their first exercise as real soldiers in a real army. So a great many of these men then went on to join the Continental Army soon after. One guy I just want to tell you a little bit about is James Curry. In my book, I tell the story of his childhood on one of the very first few pages. So he was born in 1752 in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. He immigrated at the age of 10. He was already training to be a Presbyterian minister at the age of 10. Well, they abandoned that. He and his whole family, had 4 brothers and sisters, got on a boat to sail to America. Well, the winds were not favorable, and the voyage was very, very slow. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. Disease started to spread on the boat, and people started to die. And when people died, they just tipped them overboard into the water. James Curry watched every one of his 4 brothers and sisters get tipped overboard into the ocean. They all died. His parents survived. Half the people on the boat were dead. They arrived at Philadelphia, and their dreams had already been shattered, but nonetheless, they had a new life ahead of them. And James Curry moved out here. He was at the Battle of Point Pleasant. There's away from the confluence of the rivers, there was a creek that Lewis was very concerned the Shawnee would kind of work their way down to flank his forces. So Curry and several others were posted on the high ground on the opposite side of that creek and prevented that flanking maneuver. He was shot through the arm. He got a lieutenant's commission in 1777 and served through. He finished as a captain, and there's some pretty good stories about him as a captive, but you have to buy my book to read those. We don't have time. So then, after Dunmore's War, when everybody gets home, everybody's mad at Great Britain again. And counties are starting to form committees. We usually call them committees of safety, but the Committee of Safety was really the provisional executive body in Williamsburg. It was really just like the Fincastle Committee or the Fairfax Committee where I live. This is the Fincastle Committee. They formed later than many others. They happened in two waves. In 1774, after the First Virginia Convention, Virginia formed a Virginia Association. The word boycott didn't exist yet. It was an association, but it was a boycott. And they encouraged each county to form a group to enforce it. Fincastle, being far away from Williamsburg, didn't do that yet. Then when the First Continental Congress met, they created a Continental Association. And they recommended that every county in America form an association to enforce the boycott. And that's when Fincastle acted. The famous Fincastle Resolves were part of that. Fincastle resolutions are typical in some ways, right? It professes loyalty to the king. Everybody professed loyalty to the king. They thought of themselves as Britons, as British citizens. There's lots to that I can get into, but we don't have time. They pledged support for the Protestant religion, which was a big deal at that point. We can talk about that too. They endorsed the Continental boycott, but they rejected the actions of the venal ministry and Parliament. So Parliament was the bad guys. The king was good, because he was the king. King's always good, until he's not. and that happens soon. But uniquely, still at this time, the Fincastle resolutions resolved never to surrender but at the expense of our lives. You didn't hear that in other Virginia counties yet. The Fort Gower resolves, which was signed by officers of Adam Stevens' northern wing on the way back from Point Pleasant, is pretty tough too. But other counties were not talking trash like this yet. So Fincastle resolutions are really important. Every school kid in all these counties that used to be Fincastle should read the whole thing.
They do. Don't you?
They do?
Pretend
They better. Okay. It's like this area's own Declaration of Independence. It's that important. And a year and a half before the Declaration of Independence. The war begins, and the Third Virginia Convention decides, okay, we need to actually have an army now. So they concoct this complicated system for organizing an army. They divide the entire colony into 16 military districts. And those are the districts. All of them but one, the one being the Accomack district, that's the Eastern Shore, is to recruit one company each. And those companies are to go to the 1st and the 2nd Virginia regiments. Each district is also to form one minute battalion. So they're raising Minutemen and provincial soldiers at the same time. Now, this term provincial soldiers is important. People forget that these existed. The provincial soldiers, they're just what they sound like. They are Virginia soldiers. Later, they would be called state soldiers, right, after the Declaration of Independence, when we're no longer a colony. Provincial soldiers, their job is to protect Virginia, not North Carolina, not Pennsylvania, nobody else. They are Virginia soldiers. Continental soldiers, they can go anywhere, right? Minutemen are, you know what they are. They're like part-time soldiers. They're more active than militia, but they're not full-time soldiers. They're busy enough as soldiers to not be able to keep up with the farm, right? but they're not busy enough as soldiers for that to be their profession. So the minute system did not work, but we had it for about a year. And each of these districts was supposed to form a minute battalion, 10 companies, 50 men in each. So the Fincastle County was in the Pittsylvania district. Each of these military districts was named after the first county mentioned in the ordinance. So the Pittsylvania district was Pittsylvania, Fincastle, Bedford, and Botetourt counties. 1 minute battalion, 10 companies, 1 company for the 1st Virginia Regiment. And that company was led by Captain William Campbell. The same ordinance raised 5 different independent frontier companies. So Lord Dunmore, after Dunmore's war, they had militia garrisons at various points on the frontier. Dunmore's last act as governor was to dismiss them, and then he ran away. So the frontier was defenseless. So the 3rd Virginia Convention appointed independent companies to go back out and garrison those points. So there were 2 in the extreme north at Fort Pitt. There was a Point Pleasant company at what was now called Fort Randolph, a wheeling company, and that was a small company led by, it only warranted a lieutenant, Ebenezer Zane. And then there was the Southwest Frontier Company, raised in Fincastle County. It was led by William Russell, a name many of you know, Lieutenant Joseph Crockett, 2nd Lieutenant James Knox, and 3rd Lieutenant James Craig, all of whom were later in the Continental Army. It appears, there's not a whole lot of evidence, but it appears that they were stationed for most of the time at Ramsey's Station or Ramsey's Fort on the Holston River over what's now the state line in Tennessee. People didn't know where the state line was. And the settlers there were Virginians, and people sort of considered it Virginia at that time. The threat there was the Cherokee. The threat for the 2 West Augusta companies was the Shawnee, maybe the Delaware. So William Russell, who I just mentioned, again, I won't read this whole thing. He was born in what is now Culpeper County. He was a ranger in the French and Indian War, moved out here to Castle's Woods. He, along with Daniel Boone, attempted to settle in Kentucky. This is a famous episode in 1773. They were ambushed. Actually, the back of their pack horse train was ambushed, and both of them had sons killed. And they turned around and came back home. He commanded men at Point Pleasant. He commanded that Southwest Frontier Independent Company that Crockett and Knox were in. And then in late in 76, he was appointed colonel of the 13th Virginia Regiment, which was actually from Pittsburgh. He didn't go to Pittsburgh, he met them in Pennsylvania. And then he was transferred to the 5th. I don't need to tell you more about him, except it's kind of neat. He's one of less than a dozen Revolutionary War soldiers at Arlington National Cemetery. He was reinterred there. So that stone you're looking at there is at Arlington. If you want to learn more about the independent companies, you don't have to buy my book. You can learn about it for free at the Journal of the American Revolution. I wrote 2 articles, one for the first set and another article for the second set. Just go to, the website is actually allthingsliberty.com, and there's 2 articles there. The 4th Virginia Convention then added a bunch of more regiments. Remember, the 3rd Virginia Convention created the 1st and 2nd provincial regiments. Wasn't enough. We've now had real battles. We're really at war. So they added another 7. And every county had to raise at least 1 company. None of this district nonsense anymore. Each county had to raise at least 1 company. Some counties had to raise 2. Fincastle had to raise 2. This is a page from the records of the Fincastle Committee's journal. It still exists. Maybe some of you have seen it in print because it was printed in the 50s or something. This is when Crockett and Knox were appointed, and there are their names highlighted. Kind of cool. They're appointed to the 7th Virginia Regiment and the 8th Virginia Regiment. So those are the 2 that were led by Knox and Crockett. Crockett went to the 7th Virginia Regiment, and Knox went to the 8th Virginia Regiment. This is the 7th. It shows you the counties that they're from. the 10 companies. What they tried to do was have 7 or 8 companies of musketeers, and they would be from the east, combined with 2 or 3 companies of rifles, and they would be from the west. Rifles were a frontier weapon. They were primarily hunting weapons. Long hunters used them to hunt deer. That's what they were mostly for. They were also used for self-defense. They were certainly used at the Battle of Point Pleasant, but nobody had ever seen one in Boston. It was a Virginia and Pennsylvania frontier weapon. It was an invention of the Pennsylvania Dutch. So they started in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and followed the Great Wagon Road, which comes down here and merges. The Wilderness Road is sort of a fork off the Wagon Road. The Great Philadelphia Wagon Road starts in Philadelphia, goes out through Lancaster and York and Pennsylvania, down through the Shenandoah Valley, through what's now Roanoke, and continues all the way to Augusta, Georgia. All of Appalachia was settled that way. It's the Oregon Trail of the colonial era. And that's the path that the German rifles followed. So that's why New England had no rifles. They'd never seen one before the Revolution. You see, the last company there is Joseph Crockett from Fincastle, and they would have had rifles, even though it doesn't say that there. Remember, they're all provincials when they start, but Congress wants Virginia regiments in the Continental Line, and it says, okay, we want 6 Continental regiments. So there was a lot of politics to this that you have to read my book to get the details on, but regiments 1 through 6 became Continental regiments, and regiments 7, 8, and 9 were left as provincials. So the 7th Virginia did not go north to support Washington. They were not at the Battle of Trenton. They were not at the Battle of Princeton. They were still in Virginia. What did they do? They kicked Lord Dunmore out. Pretty cool. So that is Gwynn's Island in the Chesapeake, off the mouth of the Rappahannock River. That is Lord Dunmore's last stand. That was the last place he held out in Virginia. And the 7th Virginia, they were on that little bit of land to the right, shooting at him, and you can tell that Gwynn's Island is not that big. And Dunmore fled. I can't tell the story without saying that, he recruited, he encouraged slaves and indentured servants to flee their masters and join his army. When they did, they got smallpox. And when the 7th Virginia and others crossed the water, they found, I think, hundreds of people dead, writhing on the ground. It was awful, like really awful. Smallpox is nasty, nasty stuff. It's a good thing we got rid of it. Okay, and then the 8th Virginia Regiment. So you see there's also a Fincastle company. The rest of it is raised exclusively in the West. Culpeper County is the only county east of the Blue Ridge that raised a company. Uniquely, the 8th Virginia carries all rifles. It's the only regiment in the Virginia line that was assigned to carry exclusively rifles. It is also the regiment that was commanded by the famous Peter Muhlenberg, the fighting preacher. And it's the regiment I wrote my book about. So I'll tell you about the book later. But this is where James Knox went. One of his sergeants was a guy named Robert Breckinridge. I see April nodding. Anybody else know who Robert Breckinridge was? So he and his brother were originally from Augusta County. They didn't like their stepmother, so they came down here and got a job at Smithfield. They were helping build the house. And when the war started, they both enlisted. He was not an officer. He was a sergeant in James Knox's company. And by the end of the war, he was a captain. And he later became a general and a major general in the Kentucky militia. He was Kentucky's delegate to the convention to ratify the United States Constitution. And and he was the first speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. A lowly sergeant who ran away from home. Pretty cool, huh? And that is his grave in Kentucky. You don't see it in the picture, but about 8 feet to the right is John Floyd's grave. They were like best friends. This is where the 8th Virginia went. They did not kick out Lord Dunmore. Instead, they went south to protect Charleston. So what's wrong with that? This is me seeing if you're paying attention. What kind of troops are they? Are they Continentals? Provincials. Yeah, so what's their job? To stay in Virginia. But Major General Charles Lee, who was a jerk, he said, guys, we're going south, because they were the best equipped regiment. So they went south. They ably defended Charleston at Sullivan's Island, which was it's a heck of a story if you don't know it. And then Charles Lee said, well, you know, let's go kick the Tories out of Florida now. Well, that's really far to go. Like, they've already marched 450 miles from home, and they weren't supposed to. And so he promises them plunder. They're going to go sack St. Augustine, and everything they steal, they get to keep. Okay, this is not how the Continental Army operates, right? So the authorities were very displeased with Charles Lee for that. And they made it nowhere near St. Augustine. They made it to Sunbury, Georgia, which is now a ghost town. They already had malaria, and they got bogged down, and a great many of them died of malaria. And then they hobbled home in December. So that was their heroic operations then. James Knox is, of course, part of this. William Christian. Originally from Stanton, a captain in the Cherokee War of 1758-61, married to Patrick Henry's sister. He was a Burgess from Fincastle County, one of the originals, Fincastle County Lieutenant, which is a term that needs explanation. That means he was in charge of the militia. So he's actually senior to like the colonel, although usually the militia colonel was also the county lieutenant. And I think that was the case with him. He was involved in Dunmore's War, but the Fincastle Battalion got there too late to actually fight at Point Pleasant. He was lieutenant colonel of the 1st Virginia Regiment under that complicated 70-75 system. His colonel was Patrick Henry, by the way, who was great in politics. As a soldier, he was terrible. He got passed over for promotion. Andrew Lewis was made brigadier general, and Henry quit in huff. At which point, Christian got promoted to full colonel. He resigned from that to go lead the expedition against the Cherokee in 1776. And he was later killed in combat in Kentucky. This is a simplified map of the Cherokee War of 1776. Those settlements that are in color up there, the Watauga settlement, the Nolichucky settlement, those are all Virginians that have moved across what we now know to be the state line and settled there. The Cherokee were the main threat. The British had stirred up the Cherokee. In fact, there was supposed to be a coordinated effort, but the Cherokee jumped the gun. Christian resigned from the 1st Virginia Regiment and led the expedition against the Cherokee towns, mostly North Carolina. It was coordinated on the American side with South Carolina and North Carolina. There were no big battles. They mostly just burned villages and crops. And then late in 1776, Congress has ordered Virginia to raise even more regiments. So one of them is the 13th Virginia Regiment, and its first colonel is William Russell. He does not go up to Pittsburgh, where all 10 companies were from. Actually, technically, the brand new counties of Monongalia, I say Yohogania, but I was recently told how to pronounce it properly, and I'm not remembering at the moment, and Ohio County. These are all now in West Virginia or Pennsylvania. Virginia thought that little corner of Pennsylvania was Virginia at the time, and they fought quite a bit over it. So the 13th is raised over that winter and early spring, and it then goes and joins the main Washington's Continental Army in the east. And you'll see there in yellow William Russell's regiment as part of Peter Muhlenberg's brigade. Muhlenberg has been promoted, he's now a general. There's a problem though. The 13th was recruited with the explicit promise that they could stay home. Their job was going to be to protect the settlements in the west around Pittsburgh. But after Trenton and Princeton, you know how hard that campaign was, Washington is desperate for soldiers. And so word goes out, and the 13th is forced to go east, and they're very unhappy about it. But that's a Pittsburgh story, so I won't tell you too much about it. I'm going to be in Pittsburgh in a couple of weeks, and you can watch the YouTube video later if you want. And then Adam Stevens' division includes the 7th, which is now commanded by Alexander McClanahan, who is from these parts somewhere. April, do you know? Botetourt. And the 8th Virginia, which is now commanded by Colonel Abraham Bowman from what's now Shenandoah County. That was Muhlenberg's regiment previously. So this is those are the two primary Virginia divisions at, say, the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Germantown, and going to Valley Forge. After Valley Forge, the 2-year enlistments for all of those 1776 soldiers expire. So James Knox's men are all gone, although he, in the meantime, has been transferred to Morgan's Rifles. And the Virginia line is now shrunk considerably. They don't have enough men, but they still have the same number of officers generally. So after the Battle of Monmouth, they consolidate the line, and a number of officers are made supernumerary. In other words, we have too many of you, you're fired. So the junior officers of the rank are the ones that go. Crockett and Knox have both just been promoted to major, which means that they are junior in their rank. So they're supernumerary, and they go back to Virginia. Thanks for the promotion, guys. So then in 79, Virginia decides that they've got a security issue both in the east and in the west, and they raise 4 state regiments. So same thing that would previously have been called a provincial regiment. And they're going to be 2 in the east to protect the Chesapeake, and 2 in the west to protect against Indian attacks. The 2 in the west are to be led by Joseph Crockett and James Knox, very experienced soldiers at this point. Crockett's battalion, you can see his captains there. So they're authorized in December of 79. Crockett is tasked with guarding the soldiers captured at Saratoga, who are now in Albemarle County, which is not really what they were raised for. They're there until 1781, and then they go down to North Carolina for a little while, and then they finally go west and link up with George Rogers Clark's Illinois Regiment, which is the duty that they were really supposed to have all along in the west. James Knox, I don't know who his captains were. I might be able to find the list somewhere. They are at Lynch's Ferry, or Lynchburg, for at least in December. There's a letter from Thomas Jefferson mentioning that. They're then in Powell's Valley over the winter, I think at Rye Cove Fort. They did not recruit, neither of the battalions fully recruited, and so Virginia decided they were going to merge them. So Knox is once again supernumerary. His men are folded into Crockett's battalion, and Knox is out of a job. His military career is now over. So Crockett's battalion goes west. This is a theater of the war that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Were it not for that Illinois regiment, Ohio might be part of Canada right now. In fact, it was the province of Quebec at the time, according to Britain, according to a law passed in 1773 in London. So I've got some stuff on here, some battles. The Battle of Blue Licks is maybe the most famous one from later in the war. You'll see at the very top, it says Illinois County, 1778 to 1784. Everything across the river, according to Virginia, was Illinois County. That's why Clark's regiment was called the Illinois Regiment. It's now, of course, the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio on this map, but it's also Wisconsin, Michigan, and half of Minnesota. A lot of territory, all of which might have been Canada were it not for these guys. So very important stuff. I won't get into all the battles. The most famous ones are the battles of Vincennes and Cahokia, but also lots of little little fights. Joseph Crockett, who we've been talking about, after the war, he and Knox, who seemed to be a frequent pair, right? So they were both lieutenants under Russell in the Independent Frontier Company. They were both picked to be captains at the same time in the 7th and 8th Virginia regiments. They were both made supernumerary at the same time, and they were both picked by Governor Shelby of Kentucky to widen what is now the Wilderness Road to make it fit for wagons to go. Before that, it was just pack horses. So they worked together on that. They were appointed in 1795 and did the work in 1796. You probably don't know this, but politically, after the Constitution, the West was very anti-federalist or Democratic Republican. They were with Thomas Jefferson. People in New England and other places were with Alexander Hamilton. So after that, the election of 1800, when Jefferson became president, there were all kinds of patronage jobs available for people in the West. And Crockett got a job as a U.S. Marshal. And one of the things he's most famous for, he arrested Aaron Burr. You know the Burr conspiracy? So Burr was arrested twice. The first time by Crockett, and they didn't have enough evidence. Jefferson didn't believe it, so they let him go. And it wasn't until there was hard evidence the next year that he got arrested and finally dealt with. So Crockett had quite a life. Someone has made an effort to take care of his grave, but you got to keep up with the weeding or it doesn't work. Okay, Henry Weiser. So he is buried in Pulaski County. That gravestone is fantastic. April took me to see it. It's deep in farm. It's not on the side of the road. Has anybody here gotten to see it? Yeah. You're part of the elite. I'm part of the same club. You, me, and April. It's really special. For one thing, it's an original tombstone. There are not many left, and it's wearing. I don't know what the plan is, but in another 50 years, it's going to probably be illegible. He enlisted in Frederick County, so Winchester. He marched 450 miles south to defend Charleston with a broken arm. Pretty amazing. He was picked to go with James Knox to Morgan's Rifles, which means that he was at the battles of Saratoga, so Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, there for General Burgoyne's surrender. His time was up, so he went home. When Cornwallis invaded, it was an all-hands-on-deck operation. Every man who could carry a weapon, they said, get your butt to Yorktown. And they would stick, militia with Continental officers. It didn't matter, just get down there, right? So he was one that went. So he was active in the siege of Yorktown and there to witness the surrender. So it's just amazing that if you go to the Capitol, where I used to work, and you go to the Rotunda, who's been in the Rotunda of the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol? Oh, pretty good. So there are, I think, 8 paintings there. Half of them are like exploration, it's early stuff like Pocahontas and Columbus, and the other 4 are Revolutionary War. And the 2 battle scenes are Saratoga and Yorktown. Those are the 2 big continental victories of the war. Henry Weiser was at both of them. Enlisted guys, very few can claim that. Especially from Virginia, because you had to be picked to be in Morgan's Rifles to even be there. So he was something special. My understanding is that his uniform survived. Tell us the story, April.
It survived until 1970 at Wiserton. Wiserton would be down near where the fairgrounds is at. And a big old abandoned house, well, not abandoned, semi-abandoned rambling house, and it caught on fire and burned with the uniform in there. Mm-hmm.
Tragic. Tragic. But we have his gravestone, which is beautiful. John Wyatt, now here's another good story. So he was born in London, settled in Botetourt County. He was drafted. So everybody thinks that all of our Revolutionary War soldiers were all patriots that just, they're plucky, picked up their rifle and went to war. They had to draft people. I mean, it's like every other war. We thought it was going to be easy, right? And then later on, it turns out to not be so easy, and people start coming home missing arms and legs or not coming home at all, and recruitment gets a lot harder, right? So they started having a draft. So Wyatt was drafted in 78. He was at Valley Forge and at Monmouth. He was captured at the Siege of Charleston. The deal at the surrender was that American prisoners would be allowed to stay in the barracks in Charleston, and they would get the same rations that British soldiers got. And it appears that they kept the deal for a while, except because they were not being held like in a jail or a prison ships, people started to escape. The British didn't like that. So they clamped down on it, and they ended up moving all of the enlisted guys onto prison ships. And Wyatt was not subject to this, but they started beating them and telling them that the beatings wouldn't stop unless they enlisted in the British service. And some men did it thinking, well, then I'll just run away once I'm out, in the army. Well, that British service was in Jamaica, so they didn't get to escape. Wyatt, however, what he did was he got a quart of liquor, I think rum, and he found a guy who had taken the amnesty and swore allegiance to the king and was let go. They were all offered this. Most refused it. He traded a quart of rum for that guy's pass and went home. And when he got home up here, Andrew Lewis, William Preston, William Christian, Hugh Crockett, they had a meeting with him. And they said, okay, you just got here from Charleston. We want you to impersonate a loyalist captain. We have an old commission here, signed by Lord Dunmore himself. And they sort of erased the guy's name, and they wrote John Wyatt on there. And Wyatt had a couple of British newspapers that he brought with him from Charleston, which seemed to prove that he had been with the British in Charleston, right? And his job was to go infiltrate the Tories that were camped along the New River. I don't know where. April probably knows exactly where they were. Tell us. Right over there. So they were all very worried about what was going on with these Tories. Cornwallis is now in Virginia, so the Tories are feeling very emboldened. And so Wyatt saunters up to the Tories and says, "Hey guys, I'm a loyalist captain here from the British Army, here to support you." And they said, "Wow, that's cool. Well, here's my commission. Here, look at the newspaper. This is what's going on in London." And so they invite him in, and he hangs out with the Tories for a long time. They start confiding in him because he's a captain. He's the advanced guard of the support that's coming, right? And they give him a list of all the men they've got signed up to attack the lead mines. That's what they're going to destroy the lead mines and kill the local patriot leaders. He then says, "Guys, I got to go for a little while. I'll be back in a few days." And he shows up with the local militia, and they take care of business. It's a great story. He did it all by himself. He then moved after the war to Kentucky, and he died in Indiana. And that's his gravestone. I will say that that's pretty typical. Anybody who lived out here at the time of the Revolution, they were already mobile, right? These are not people these were not wallflowers. They wanted to go west. And when the opportunity came, many of them went further west. First to Kentucky, then Ohio, then Indiana. Some of them died in Missouri. It's pretty neat. Okay, so the Wilderness Road. We're in the Wilderness Road Museum, so we need to talk a little bit about it. It was not originally a road. It was an Indian path, then it was a trace. So a trace is like a pack horse trace. Too skinny for a wagon. Yeah, you can only take pack horses. Many early settlers, including some that were guided by James Knox, would take their wagons to the Cumberland Gap and then abandon them and keep going on pack horses. I have not been to this thing personally, but there is a marker in Livingston, Kentucky, that has these images on four sides that sort of explains the story of the trace and then the road. And I think it does a pretty good job, so I thought I'd show you. Each one has a picture above it. I only have 3 sides here. The first one is natives on the Indian Trail. Then there's Skaggs Trace, Boone's Trace, and then the Wilderness Road. Notice that I like that they distinguish between Boone's Trace and the Wilderness Road, because I want James Knox to get credit for the road. This is what they say. I won't read them, but as I said, there was an Indian Trail. Skaggs was into Kentucky across the Cumberland Gap before Boone was. Many people had been, actually. The first Virginian was 1750. It was used by long hunters to go over there and hunt. And then Boone's Trace, he cleared the trace for settlers, but it was still a trace. And then in 1795, Isaac Shelby, the governor of Kentucky, appointed James Knox and Joseph Crockett to widen it into a road so that wagons could go through. And now it's finally properly the Wilderness Road. Knox, who I like to brag about, obviously, he's buried in Kentucky. You can see his tombstone there. The picture on the top right is at Camp Knox. So this is from his 1770 expedition with, I think, 40 long hunters. They split up and went in different directions. That monument is at the site where they camped. They had a skin house there where they would go hunt, and then they would bring back their dressed deer skins and store them there. Indians burned it and they lost everything. And that's the site. It's pretty remote. And then Knox County, Kentucky, which is right on the Wilderness Road, right where Knox did all this stuff. If you read all the old history books, it says that it's named after General Henry Knox. Clearly not true. When they named counties at that time, they named them all after local heroes or people who had supported Virginia or Kentucky at the time. They definitely didn't name anything after Federalists. And Henry Knox was a Federalist member of Washington's cabinet. So there's no way it's named after Henry Knox. It's named after James Knox. So that's the full presentation. If you want to learn more, this is my website, virginia1776.com. I have an old website which was just about the 8th Virginia, and that's 8thvirginia.com. If you want to learn about James Knox, there's a fair amount there. If you want to learn about Virginia or see what I'm doing now, with other people, by the way, it's this website. I have a Facebook feed. Stuff goes up, some little interesting history tidbit just about every day. So if you're on Facebook, I'd encourage you to follow. And then I will have audio on top of this PowerPoint with some additional images and maybe even some video up on YouTube in a few days. This is my book. I've got a bag full of them there. It's about the 8th Virginia Regiment. It features this area prominently. I say fairly confidently that it is the most detailed Revolutionary War regimental history ever written. They're just really hard to do, and I was crazy enough to spend 20 years researching it. I think it's also a good introduction to Virginia and the Revolutionary War, because I explain how things were organized and how things were done. And that's what we got.
Thank you. Thank you.